An elderly black man walked into the courthouse dressed in a crisp suit, carrying a briefcase. But before he could take 2 steps, a young cop stopped him cold and ordered, "Wait outside." What the officer didn't know, that man wasn't just any visitor. He was the judge of the courtroom, and what happened next left the entire room in stunned silence. This is a story about assumptions, respect, and a lesson that officer will never forget. Step outside and wait. Those 4 words hit like a wall the moment the elderly black man walked into the courthouse lobby. His posture was upright, his movements deliberate, and his presence quiet yet commanding. He wore a crisp gray suit, polished shoes that reflected the marble floors, and carried a well-worn leather briefcase tucked neatly under his arm. To anyone paying attention, he looked every bit the professional. But to the young police officer guarding the entrance, he was just another visitor. The officer's hand shot out, stopping him in his tracks. Without a glance of recognition, he ordered firmly, "Sir, this area is restricted. You'll need to step outside until you're called." The man paused. His deep brown eyes studied the officer with calm patience. He could have spoken up. He could have corrected the officer right then and there. But instead, he offered only a small nod, turned slowly, and stepped aside. Outside the lobby doors, he leaned gently against the wall. People rushed past him, lawyers in tailored suits, clerks balancing stacks of files, nervous defendants whispering anxiously to their families. Not a single person stopped to wonder who he was or why a man of his age and dignity was waiting outside. The officer, standing tall at his post, felt no doubt about his decision. To him, rules were rules. If someone looked out of place, they had no business walking through without permission. He didn't notice the details that mattered. The law books peeking out of the briefcase, the small golden pin of office on the man's lapel, or the way he carried himself with quiet authority. What the officer didn't realize was that the man he had just dismissed was not a visitor at all. He was the judge, the very one who would soon preside over the courtroom. The officer straightened his shoulders, satisfied with himself. To him, this was part of the job, maintaining order, controlling who came in and out, making sure no one crossed a line they weren't supposed to. He didn't think twice about the elderly man he had just turned away. But on the other side of those courthouse doors, Judge Richardson leaned quietly against the wall, watching the flow of people with thoughtful eyes. At 73, he had lived through decades of being underestimated. He had once been a young law student, told he'd never make it to the bar. He had been a lawyer told he wasn't polished enough for big cases. And even as a judge, wearing the black robe of authority, he had often felt the sting of people doubting him before they knew his name. This moment was nothing new. And yet it was a reminder that, even with all his achievements, society often judged him first by the color of his skin and the wrinkles on his face rather than the wisdom he carried. The officer, meanwhile, didn't notice the subtle signs that might have told a different story. The embossed initials on the leather briefcase, the gold pin that symbolized his years of service, the calm dignity in his stance. Those details were invisible to someone who had already made up his mind. The courthouse lobby grew louder. Lawyers rushed in with stacks of files, their voices sharp and urgent. Clerks shuffled papers as defendants whispered nervously with family members. All the while, Judge Richardson stood silently outside, unbothered, patient. He knew something the officer didn't. Very soon, the assumptions would shatter. Very soon, the truth would reveal itself in a way that the young officer would never forget. The minutes ticked by and the courthouse buzzed with activity. Lawyers hurried into the courtroom, their arms loaded with documents. Defendants shuffled nervously behind their attorneys, whispering frantic last-minute questions. The officer by the door stood tall and vigilant, still unaware that the man he had dismissed was patiently waiting outside. Then, with a sudden hush, the bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom doors. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Richardson." The words hit the officer like a lightning bolt. He blinked in surprise, his head snapping up. Judge Richardson? That name carried weight. Everyone in the building knew of him, one of the most respected judges in the county. A man with a reputation for fairness, wisdom, and an unshakable sense of justice. The officer had heard his name whispered in admiration by lawyers, even mentioned during training sessions as an example of true integrity. The crowd in the courtroom immediately rose to their feet, their heads bowed in respect. And then the doors opened. Walking in with quiet authority was the same elderly man the officer had told to wait outside. But this time, he wasn't in a gray suit. He wore the long black robe of his office. His steps were steady, deliberate, and full of dignity. The room seemed to shift as he entered. Everyone knew they were in the presence of authority. The officer's heart sank. His stomach twisted with embarrassment as realization hit him like a wave. He hadn't just dismissed an old man, he had dismissed the very judge who would preside over the courtroom. And now, that same man, with calm eyes and quiet power, was taking his rightful seat at the bench. The officer stood frozen, knowing a lesson was about to unfold that he would never forget. Judge Richardson adjusted his glasses, settled into his chair, and let his eyes sweep across the courtroom. The atmosphere was heavy with silence. Lawyers stood frozen, clerks hesitated mid-step, and even the defendants seemed to sense something unusual was unfolding. But Judge Richardson wasn't looking at them, his gaze fixed squarely on the officer by the door. The same officer who had just told him to wait outside like a man who didn't belong. "Officer," the judge said, his voice deep and commanding, "may I ask you a question?" The words rang through the room like a gavel strike. The officer stiffened, his throat suddenly dry. "Yes, Your Honor," he stammered. "When I entered this courthouse earlier," the judge continued slowly, "you asked me to step outside. Tell me, why did you make that choice?" The officer's face turned pale. Every pair of eyes in the courtroom shifted toward him, waiting. His lips parted, but only fragments of words came out. Finally, he managed to whisper, I didn't recognize you, sir. I assumed you were just here for other reasons." The judge leaned forward, his expression calm but piercing. "You assumed, and assumptions, officer, are dangerous. They are born not from knowledge, but from prejudice and haste." He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the room. "In this courtroom, assumptions can destroy lives. They can rob a person of their freedom, strip them of their dignity, or deny them justice." The officer lowered his gaze, shame burning in his chest. Yet Judge Richardson's tone softened. "Mistakes happen, but wisdom comes from recognizing them. Remember, respect should not be given based on who you think someone is. It should be given because every human being deserves it." The lesson struck deeper than any punishment ever could. The rest of the day unfolded as usual. Cases were called, lawyers argued, and verdicts were delivered, but the air in the courtroom felt different. Everyone present had witnessed a moment they would carry with them long after they left those walls. The young officer, though still at his post, was no longer the same man who had stood there confidently earlier that morning. His pride had been replaced by humility. He had been taught a lesson not in anger, not through public humiliation, but through wisdom delivered with dignity. At the close of the session, when the gavel struck and the courtroom emptied, the officer quietly approached Judge Richardson in his chambers. His voice trembled, but his words were sincere. "Your Honor, I'm sorry. I judged you without thought. I'll never make that mistake again." The judge looked at him with steady eyes. He could have scolded him further or dismissed him outright. Instead, he offered something far more valuable: grace. "Growth begins," Judge Richardson said, "when you recognize where you went wrong. Carry that lesson, officer, not just here in the courthouse, but in every interaction you have. Because respect is not a privilege, it is a right." The officer nodded, his chest heavy but his heart open. He knew those words would stay with him for life. And as word of the encounter spread through the courthouse, it became more than just a personal lesson. It became a story, a reminder to every lawyer, clerk, officer, and visitor that first impressions can mislead. But dignity and respect must always remain, because you never know who someone really is until the moment they reveal it. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more real, powerful stories that inspire and make you think. And remember, every story holds a lesson. The question is, are we willing to learn it?